Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat? The voice was crisp professional, but edged with a barely concealed impatience. Samuel Wright, 88 years old, didn't turn his head from the small oval window. Below, the tarmac shimmered in the midday sun, a sprawling concrete world of baggage carts and fuel trucks. He had seen 1,000 runways just like it. Some had welcomed him home with cheers, others with the silence of a mission accomplished in the dead of night. This one just felt noisy. Sir, the flight attendant whose name tag read Grace tried again, her voice a little louder this time. This is business class. I need to see your boarding pass. A man in the seat across the aisle, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Samuel's first car, let out an audible sigh. He flicked an imaginary piece of lint from his creased trousers and shot a pointed look at Grace, an unspoken command to resolve this situation quickly. Samuel finally turned, his movement slow and deliberate. His eyes, a pale washed-out blue, held a placid depth that seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the cabin around him. He looked at the young woman at the perfectly applied makeup and the tight bun of blonde hair, and offered a small, polite nod. "Seat 14, Alpha," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "That's what the ticket says." Grace's smile was a thin painted-on line. "I understand, sir, but sometimes there are mix-ups. Perhaps you'd let me just double-check it for you." The man in the suit, Jonathan, couldn't contain himself any longer. "For goodness sake, just check the ticket so we can get on our way. Some of us have meetings to get to that actually matter," he said it to Grace. But his dismissive gaze was fixed on Samuel's simple tweed jacket and worn corduroy trousers. He looked to Jonathan's discerning eye like a man who had wandered out of a thrift store and onto the wrong airplane. Samuel's hands, gnarled with age and speckled with liver spots, reached into his jacket pocket. They were steady, rock steady. He pulled out a creased paper boarding pass and held it out. Grace took it from him, holding it by the very edges, as if it might be contagious. She scanned it, her expression flickering from condescension to confusion, and then back to a more fortified version of condescension. The pass was legitimate. "Seat 14 Alpha, Samuel Wright." "Well," she said, handing it back with a huff, "everything appears to be in order." The subtext was clear. She didn't understand how, but the paperwork was unfortunately correct. "Please place your carry-on fully under the seat in front of you, sir. We'll be closing the cabin doors shortly." Samuel gave another quiet nod and turned back to his window. He didn't have a carry-on to put away. Everything he needed was in the pockets of his jacket. Jonathan scoffed loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Unbelievable. They let anyone up here these days. Probably used his life savings on the ticket. Grace shot Jonathan a look that was part appeasement, part shared frustration, before continuing her pre-flight duties. The confrontation seemed over, but the air in the front of the cabin remained thick with a sour, unspoken judgment. Samuel didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the ground crew, their movements a familiar ballet of precision and purpose. The situation, however, was far from resolved. Grace, emboldened by the support of the passenger in 15 Bravo, decided to press the issue. She returned with the lead flight attendant, a severe-looking woman named Patricia. "This is the gentleman, Patricia," Grace said, gesturing toward Samuel. "I verified his ticket, but, well," she trailed off, letting Patricia's eyes do the work. Patricia's gaze swept over Samuel, taking in the worn-out jacket, the scuffed shoes, and the quiet stillness of the old man. Her lips tightened. "Sir," Patricia began, her voice dripping with authority, "we've had a complaint from another passenger about a potential seating discrepancy. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you a few questions. Are you feeling all right today? Do you know where you're headed?" The condescension was now overt, painting Samuel as a confused senior who had somehow stumbled into a world where he didn't belong. He looked up at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than patience crossed his face. It wasn't anger, it was a profound, bone-deep weariness. "I'm feeling fine, thank you," Samuel said, his voice steady. "And I'm headed to Seattle. My ticket, as your colleague saw, confirms that." Jonathan chimed in again, his voice oozing with false concern. "Look, maybe the old-timer is confused. It happens. My grandfather gets lost in his own house. Just move him to the back of the plane. We'll all be happier." A few other passengers murmured in agreement, the desire to get airborne overriding any sense of decency. They saw an obstacle, a delay personified in an old man in a cheap jacket. They didn't see the man. The pressure was mounting. Patricia, the lead attendant, crossed her arms. Sir, your ticket may be valid, but airline policy gives us the right to reseat or deplane any passenger who may be a source of disturbance. Several passengers are now disturbed. Samuel's hand rested on his lap, fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of a worn brass compass on his other arm. It was a simple, unadorned piece of dark weathered metal cracked with age, the kind of thing a sailor might carry. Jonathan noticed it, a sneer twisting his lips. What's that thing on his wrist? Probably hasn't taken it off in 50 years. Is that even sanitary? The comment hung in the air. A piece of casual cruelty designed to strip away the last of the old man's dignity. The compass. It was just a piece of metal, but to Samuel, it was a lifeline to another world, another time. The sterile climate-controlled air of the cabin dissolved. For a split second, the scent of recycled air was replaced by the acrid smell of jet fuel and scorched earth. The gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit became the deafening roar of a PBY Catalina screaming down a runway in the Pacific. A young man with bright, confident eyes and a reckless grin. David Sullivan was leaning against the cockpit, strapping an identical brass compass onto a younger Samuel's wrist. David's own was already in place. "One for the road, Shepherd," he'd said, his voice nearly lost in the engine noise. "So, you remember which way is up. Brings you home." The memory was a flash, a physical jolt as sharp and sudden as an ejection. It was over in a heartbeat, leaving Samuel back in the plush leather of seat 14 Alpha, the weight of the years settling back onto his shoulders. He looked down at the compass. David never made it home. The captain's arrival was the final act of this humiliating play. Summoned by Patricia, Captain Emma Foster strode down the aisle, her crisp white shirt and gold epaulets radiating an aura of ultimate authority. She was young, with a serious, no-nonsense face. She listened with a grim expression as Patricia and Grace explained the situation, their words painting Samuel as a confused, possibly disruptive elderly passenger. Jonathan added his own 2 cents about the delay and the comfort of his fellow premier passengers. A few rows back, a young man named Lucas had been watching the entire scene with a knot tightening in his stomach. He was an aviation enthusiast on his way to an air show. There was something about the old man, his posture, the unnerving calm in his eyes, the way he met every insult with a quiet dignity that didn't add up. It wasn't confusion, it was control, an immense unshakable control that Lucas had only ever read about in books about test pilots and astronauts. The captain was now standing over the old man. "Sir, I'm Captain Foster. It seems we have a problem." This was it. They were going to throw him off the plane. Lucas knew he had to do something. He pulled out his phone. The cabin doors were still open. He had a minute, maybe 2. He sent a frantic text to his friend Tyler, an air traffic controller at the regional tower. Lucas didn't know exactly what he hoped to accomplish, but Tyler was well connected. He knew people in military aviation. The message was simple but desperate. "Old vet getting kicked off my flight. Seat 14 Alpha. Check the name Samuel Wright. Something about him. Please." He hit send and held his breath. On the other end, Tyler was in the middle of coordinating a departure sequence when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the text, frowning. Samuel Wright. The name rang a distant bell. He pulled up a database, cross-referencing veterans with the Air Force service records accessible to controllers for certain clearances. What came back made his blood run cold. He immediately picked up a secure line and made a call he never thought he'd have to make to the operations officer at McCord Air Force Base. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Captain Foster was kneeling beside Samuel's seat. "Sir, I need to understand what's happening here. Your ticket is valid, but if there's been a misunderstanding, I need to know." Samuel looked at her directly. His gaze was not defiant, just infinitely tired. "There's no misunderstanding, Captain. I bought a ticket. I have a seat. I'm just an old man trying to get to Seattle, nothing more." Jonathan couldn't resist one more jab. Maybe he's trying to relive his glory days. Probably worked on planes or something back in the day. Grace, standing nearby, felt a pang of something. Guilt, maybe. She looked at the old man's face, the deep lines etched by decades of something she couldn't quite name. Captain Foster stood, clearly wrestling with the situation. She was about to make a decision, the wrong decision, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an urgent message from the airline's operations center. They had been contacted by McCord Air Force Base. The message was terse but clear. "Hold Flight 732. Passenger Samuel Wright, Seat 14 Alpha. Military escort inbound. Do not, repeat, do not deplane this passenger. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Military escort? For this old man? She looked back at Samuel, who was now gazing out the window with that same placid, unreadable expression. Captain Foster's mind raced. She turned to the cabin, her voice suddenly firm and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to take their seats immediately. We have a slight delay, but I assure you, we will be departing shortly." Jonathan started to protest, but the look Captain Foster gave him silenced him instantly. Grace and Patricia exchanged confused glances. The captain moved to the front of the cabin and picked up the intercom. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Foster. It has come to my attention that we have a very special passenger on board today." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "In seat 14 Alpha is Colonel Samuel Wright. Some of you may not know this name, and that's because men like Colonel Wright don't seek recognition. But I'm going to tell you who he is. During World War II, Colonel Wright flew PBY Catalina seaplanes on search and rescue missions across the Pacific. He flew into enemy-held waters under fire, into storms that would down most aircraft, into the jaws of hell itself to bring our boys home. He saved over 200 lives, 200 sons, brothers, fathers who made it home because of him. The cabin fell into a stunned, reverent silence. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Patricia's face drained of color. Jonathan looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Captain Foster's voice grew stronger, filled with emotion. He earned the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, a dozen distinguished flying crosses, and the Purple Heart. A man known to his allies and deeply feared by his enemies by a single name. The captain took a deep breath. His call sign was Shepherd. The name dropped into the cabin like a thunderclap. Lucas, the young man in the back, gasped. He knew that name. Every aviation buff knew it. It was a legend, a ghost story whispered by pilots. Shepherd, the pilot who flew missions no one else would take, who went into the darkest of nights and came back with ghosts. As if on cue, a low, powerful roar began to build outside the aircraft. It was a sound unlike any commercial jet engine, a deep guttural thunder that vibrated through the very frame of the plane. Passengers on the left side of the aircraft gasped and pointed. Captain Foster gestured towards the windows, and as a small token of the respect he is owed, she said, her voice thick with emotion, "We have just been informed that we will have a special escort for the first leg of our journey." The plane began to slowly taxi away from the gate, and there, just off their left wing, pulling into a perfect, impossibly close formation, was a machine of breathtaking power and menace. An F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced fighter jet in the world, its geometric gray skin seeming to drink the sunlight. A moment later, its twin appeared off the right wing, flanking them in a display of awesome aerial might. Passengers scrambled for their phones, pressing their faces against the glass. The cabin, which moments before had been a theater of petty judgment, was now filled with gasps of wonder. In the cockpit of the F-35 on Samuel's side, the pilot, a dark silhouette behind his visor, turned his head. He slowly, deliberately raised a gloved hand to his helmet in a crisp salute. Then a new voice crackled over the cabin's intercom, patched through directly from the fighter jet. It was young, clear, and filled with a profound respect. "An absolute honor to be your wingman today, Shepherd. The skies are yours, sir." The cabin erupted. The tension broke in a wave of spontaneous, thunderous applause. Passengers were on their feet, clapping, cheering, their phones held high to capture the incredible sight. Jonathan sat frozen in his seat, his face a ghastly shade of white, his jaw hanging open. He looked as if he might be sick. Grace, the flight attendant, leaned against a bulkhead, her face buried in her hands, shaking with shame. Through it all, Samuel Wright simply sat looking out his window at the young pilot in the F-35. He watched the sleek fighter hold its position with effortless grace, a symbol of a legacy he had helped to build. A single tear, the first he had shed in decades, traced a slow path through the weathered lines of his face. He raised a slightly trembling hand and gave the pilot a slow, small nod, acknowledged after the plane reached cruising altitude, and the F-35s had peeled off with a final magnificent wing waggle. A fragile peace settled over the cabin. The applause had died down, replaced by odd whispers. Passengers kept glancing at seat 14 Alpha, looking at the quiet old man as if he were a living monument. Captain Foster made her way back down the aisle. She paused where Grace and Jonathan were sitting. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were quiet, precise, and colder than the air outside the cockpit window. "To you," she said to a mortified Grace, "your conduct was a disgrace to this airline and your uniform. We will be having a formal review upon it landing." She then turned her steely gaze to Jonathan. "And to you, sir, your behavior was despicable. You judged a man by his clothes and in doing so revealed a complete lack of character. I suggest you spend the rest of this flight reflecting on that." Jonathan shrank into his expensive seat, unable to meet anyone's eye. The public humiliation was absolute. Finally, the captain approached Samuel's seat and knelt, bringing herself eye level with the old hero. "Colonel, I don't know how to apologize enough for what happened." Samuel looked away from the clouds and met the young captain's gaze. His pale blue eyes were gentle, holding no trace of anger. "It's all right, daughter," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "People see an old man, and that's all they see. They forget that old men were once young. They forget what those men did, what they saw." He gestured out the window toward the empty sky where the jets had been. "That uniform you wear, and the one that young man was wearing, they're about service. They mean you serve the people inside this plane. All of them, not just the ones in expensive suits. You remember that the lesson was delivered not as a rebuke, but as a piece of quiet, hard-earned wisdom." Samuel's gaze drifted down to the worn brass compass on his wrist. The image of David Sullivan, young and full of life, flashed in his mind again. But this time, the memory was longer, more painful. It wasn't the airfield in the Pacific. It was a ditch beside a burning heap of metal that used to be a plane. Samuel was pulling David from the wreckage, the heat searing his own skin. David was dying, his breathing shallow. With his last ounce of strength, he had pulled the brass compass from his own wrist and pressed it into Samuel's hand. "Wear it for both of us, Shepherd," he had whispered, his eyes full of the sky he would never fly in again. "Bring us home." The story of Flight 732 went viral before the plane even landed in Seattle. The videos of the C-35 escort, the captain's speech, and the mortified faces of Grace and Jonathan were everywhere. The airline, caught in a public relations firestorm, issued a formal apology to Colonel Wright and announced a mandatory new training program for all staff, developed with a veterans advocacy group, focusing on dignity and respect for all passengers, especially the elderly and former service members. Jonathan's company, whose logo was visible on his briefcase in several clips, released a statement condemning his behavior and placing him on indefinite leave. Weeks later, Samuel was in his usual booth at a small diner near his home, a quiet place where he could read the paper and watch the world go by. A woman approached his table, her steps hesitant. It was Grace, the flight attendant. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, and her face was free of the professional makeup she had worn on the plane. She looked younger and deeply tired. "Colonel Wright," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to apologize in person. What I did. There's no excuse for it. I was wrong." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm in the new training program. I'm listening. I'm trying to learn." Samuel looked up from his newspaper and gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "Sit down," he said gently. She did. He didn't lecture her. He didn't admonish her. Instead, he told her a story. He told her about a young pilot named David Sullivan and a promise made in the smoke and fire of a long-forgotten war. He told her about the brass compass. He shared a piece of his pain, not to wound her, but to help her understand that every person carries a history, a story that deserves respect. When he finished, she was crying silently. He simply pushed the napkin holder toward her. "Forgiveness is the first step," he said, "for you and for me." After she left, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Samuel turned his gaze back to the window. He sipped his coffee, the diner quiet around him. High above, a commercial jetliner carved a thin white scar across the deep blue canvas of the sky. He watched it until it was just a tiny silver glint in the distance. And Samuel Wright, the man they called Shepherd, smiled. The quiet heroes walk among us every day. If you were moved by Colonel Wright's story, please hit the like button, share this video to honor all our veterans, and subscribe to Be Our Veterans Stories for more stories of courage and character.